This episode is part 2 of our 2-part series on James Silk Buckingham, the editor of the Calcutta Journal. If you haven't listened to part 1, press pause here and go back and listen to it. We will still be here when you're back. And now for part 2 of our 2-part feature on James Silk Buckingham.
In the last episode, we told you the origin story of Cornishman James Silk Buckingham, who arrived in Calcutta in 1818 as the captain of a ship called the Humayun Shah. He was given an assignment to carry slaves as cargo on his ship, and he declined it on moral grounds. His refusal to be a party to human trafficking earned him many admirers in old Calcutta, but by doing this, he had also thumbed his nose at the conservative British group in Colonial Bengal. At a loss for employment after he stepped down from his captaincy, Buckingham was asked to become the editor of a newspaper called the Calcutta Journal. He agreed, and within a few months, the Calcutta Journal had outstripped its competitors and had a dedicated audience. Just like William Duane did with his newspaper, The Indian World, that we covered in episodes 5 and 6 of this podcast, Buckingham turned the Calcutta Journal into a republic of letters. However, he often got into trouble for what he was printing and never apologized even after being reprimanded by the East India Company government censor William Butterworth Bailey. Buckingham believed that the press was free and would not compromise on this principle. Unfortunately, John Adam, who we met in the previous episode, the man who had acted as the censor under Governor-General Wellesley, but was now elevated to the Supreme Council of Calcutta, did not think that editors of newspapers should have any power that could sway public opinion against the East India Company. He believed that the public could not control a government and what it did. It had to be the other way around. Thus was set a conflict in the making between John Adam as the voice of conservatism and James Buckingham as the voice of progress and a free press. This is Reality Scribes. I am Sumit Chaturvedi.
And I'm Vasundhara Sarnath. We are Indian journalists who are, in this podcast, telling you the story of the origins of Indian journalism. We are taking you through the history of Indian society's news and information ecosystems, our news culture, and how these have evolved over years, decades, and centuries. Shortly after the kerfuffle with both the Bengal and Madras presidencies' authorities, Buckingham published a letter that criticized the official inspection of riverboats. A man called Greenway was the boat secretary, and, angered by this public criticism of his department and his work, he sued the Calcutta Journal for libel. Greenway also wanted to make some money, so he sued for damages worth 20,000 rupees. As things went, the court awarded him 1 rupee. In a sense, Buckingham had won again. The Greenway libel case was important in setting a precedent that libel cases against the press could not be tried arbitrarily outside the courts. If you recall, if you've listened to some of our previous episodes, sometimes editors would be deported for libel on the orders of governor-generals without ever facing trial in a court of law. However, Buckingham wasn't the type to stray from controversy for too long. On November 6, 1820, the Calcutta Journal published a letter from a writer who called himself Amulace. The letter was a longish rant against how India was administered by the British. It was referred to Advocate General Spanky, who pronounced it libelous and said that the editor should be prosecuted. Buckingham asked them to drop the prosecution, saying that A. he hadn't written the letter, and B. he didn't actually agree with Amulis, the letter writer. Advocate General Spanky thought that this was a stupid defense and proceeded with the case anyway. He could do so because the one man who could protect Buckingham, that was the Governor-General Francis Rawdon Hastings, was out of town. At the trial, Buckingham's lawyer was a man called Cutler Ferguson. Ferguson defended Buckingham against any wrongdoing and asked for a trial postponement. When Governor-General Rawdon Hastings returned to Calcutta, Buckingham wrote to him directly, saying he didn't agree with the Amulis letter, and so he didn't know why he was being prosecuted. Hastings was lenient again. He said that the case would be dropped if Buckingham could write an apology that could be read in the Supreme Court. For once, Buckingham, who hated apologizing for things he had published, agreed to do so. In January 1821, when the case went to trial after the postponement, the apology was read. Buckingham stated that he had no malicious intent in publishing the Amulis effusion and that it was done inadvertently. But one man objected to how the case was being dropped: John Adam. It became clear that he had instigated the prosecution against Buckingham. After that, things were calm for a few months. But in the middle of 1821, Buckingham published a letter which targeted military chaplains in interior posts of India. The letter writer, who identified himself as a churchman and a friend of a lady on her deathbed, alleged that the chaplains travelled away from their posts for long durations frequently, leaving the people at the posts without any spiritual guidance. This annoyed the Lord Bishop of Calcutta. People in the service of God could not be called into question. Buckingham was asked to reveal the letter writer's name and refused to do so. He was reprimanded and threatened by the government. His license, they said, could be revoked and he could be deported if he didn't watch it. Bailey, the censor, had about had it with him.
But Buckingham was made of sterner stuff. He again defended the freedom of the press. Bailey did not back down either. He stated that there was no change in the sentiment or resolution of the government with respect to the offending letter about chaplains leaving their posts. So Buckingham did the public a favor. He produced a pamphlet which contained all his communication with the authorities ever since he had arrived in India. This tract was called A Brief Statement of the Principal Events Connected with the Question of Summary Transportation Without Trial as a Punishment for Offences Through the Press in India. In short, this pamphlet, which was widely circulated, often covertly, outlined the threats of deportation he had faced repeatedly for being a fair-minded critic of the government. The outcome of this move was that Buckingham had now provoked a public discussion of the law. Think of it as an exhaustive Twitter thread against a government's vendetta against him. Imagine the retweets he would have gotten. There was no doubt that by 1820, even before the Greenway libel and the Amulis prosecution, the Calcutta Journal had already outstripped its competitors. After these highly talked about cases involving Buckingham and the Calcutta Journal, many other publications had to shut shop because they could not keep up with the Calcutta Journal and its increasing popularity. But then another problem arose. Now there was no mouthpiece for the conservative point of view. Buckingham was an unapologetic anti-conservative element who had openly attacked everything that the conservative faction stood for. To make it worse, Buckingham could not help indulging in a bit of self-praise and gloating about his publishing wins. With this absence, this lack of a mouthpiece, resentment against him grew amongst the old Tories of Calcutta. They plotted, schemed, and planned. In June 1821, John Trotter, an opium agent, Richard Plowden, a salt agent and collector of land revenue, Thomas Lewin, a barrister, and C.B. Greenlaw, only identified as a pluralist, launched John Bull in the East, a rival newspaper to the Journal. The outline mission of the Bull, as it came to be popularly known, was to quote-unquote not seek popularity or revile our holy religion or libel authorities and insult public decency under the cloak of liberty and freedom of the press. Essentially, the owners of the Bull were proclaiming that they thought Buckingham was a popularity-seeking, Christianity-hating, indecent fraud. The editorial post of the Bull was given to a person named James Mackenzie. As Ralph Turner, Buckingham's biographer, writes, all contemporary evidence agrees that the Bull was violent. The paper war between the Calcutta Journal and the Bull began raging in 1821. Buckingham was quick to counter the Bull's initial attack on the Calcutta Journal. Buckingham wrote that Calcutta Journal was about holding to account those who trampled on social order, treated the ethic of civilian subordination as a form of slavery, and trampled on the free press. But John Bull was out for blood. They hounded Buckingham and the Calcutta Journal. When there was an accident in the Calcutta Journal's printing room, the Bull reported it. When the Calcutta Journal was excluded from the government house and military headquarters, the Bull publicly gloated. Buckingham for once thought that he should throw in the towel. He asked the public to seriously think about the press rules. Why was the Bull attacking him and his paper personally?
And then a letter writer called Sam Sobersides came into the frame. According to Ralph Turner, Buckingham's biographer, Sam Sobersides presented himself as someone who was just bored at Chowrangi dinner parties. But when it came to formal balls, Sam Sobersides was bored to death. In a missive, Sam Sobersides described these events. He wrote, military men in comfortable warm woolen coats, buttoned up to the throat, with tight pantaloons and boots, an ungainly or cocked hat under the arm, a sword quarrelling with their legs, civilians a little more at ease but throttled in a dandy neckcloth brought from Moscow, unable to turn their heads without turning the body. On entering the room, we see a couple dozen ladies ranged by themselves on formal rows of chairs, like trees in the avenues of a Dutchman's pleasure grounds, and 4 or 5 dozen harnessed gentlemen moping about. It was clear from this sort of satirical and deprecating writing that Sam Sobersides was bored and tired of such events. He complained about and mocked Calcutta's high society. He thought people were retired, selfish, lonely and churlish. He even wanted the King of England to come to India and reduce the size of the shako, the military headdress. What Sam Sobersides was doing was stripping away the careful aura of respect and good manners that had a lot to do with how the British were perceived by locals and by themselves. He was caricaturing British high society in Bengal, and that drew in angry opponents. A letter writer called Parenthesis called out Sam Sobersides for maligning good English manners and the government in the Calcutta Journal in turn. Parenthesis thought if Sam Sobersides' recommendations for less formal attire were to be adopted, the English would be Frenchifying themselves soon by dancing the waltz and dining in shirt sleeves. Unfortunately, Sam Sobersides decided to feed the troll, something we all know today not to do on X. He responded to Parenthesis by saying that he was not maligning the government, he was just pointing things out, that if no one drew attention to wrongs, nothing would be addressed. All these letters and exchanges were published in the paper, an epistolary reality show of sorts. We had Callie Wilkinson weigh in here.
Writing anonymously was very controversial in this period. A lot of people did it, though critics of this form of writing argued okay, if something's written anonymously, how can we know that it's real? How can we know that it's credible? How can we corroborate what's being said? And how can we kind of interrogate this person and figure out what's really going on? Like, it's much easier to lie if you're writing anonymously because there's no repercussions. You can lie or exaggerate and, nothing will happen to you. But then on the other hand, for army officers especially, they say because it's quite risky professionally and personally to write some of these things, the only way they're ever going to get written is if you write it anonymously because the risks are so great. So already a lot of the debates that we have about whistleblowing, they are also having because they're thinking about, okay, how can we actually ensure good faith? How can we ensure the credibility of these accounts? But also, like, how can we keep people safe? So the dynamics are quite familiar already.
The problem was that the Sobersides letter that were published between September and October 1821 had enough material in them for the government at the time to start thinking in terms of libel. Imagine criticizing the social life of the elites being grounds for libel. Sure enough, Buckingham and the Calcutta Journal once again got charged with criminal libel. One libel suit was brought at the behest of the 7 chief secretaries of the government. The second criminal libel case was brought forward by Spanky, the Advocate General. Buckingham responded with wry humor. He wrote that the indictment was 13 feet by 2 in size and so long that it could not be copied in 2 hours. Oddly, both Parenthesis and Sam Sobersides also defended Buckingham in further letters. However, for a short while, Buckingham stopped publishing critical letters even though he asserted to his readers that no combination of wealth and power could subdue him. He even found Governor General Hastings' speech on press freedom that he had given after cancelling the censorship rules and quoted from it in a bid to mobilize public opinion. As always, we have to remember the one guy who had always kept a sharp eye on Buckingham, John Adam. He saw Buckingham's bold use of the Governor-General's speech as a way to get back at him. He said that Buckingham had insulted the government. What is more, John Adams stated to the Bengal Council that the only reason he had not recommended immediate deportation of Buckingham was because it would look bad if this was done before any trial. Adam had not budged from his position on Buckingham, that his sole aim was to destroy any and all respect for the government. Governor-General Hastings was deliberate as usual. He could not be steamrolled into doing anything hasty. But Hastings was bothered because there was talk of raising money publicly to help Buckingham in his defense. Possibly, Hastings saw this as a sign of Buckingham's growing popularity within the British public in Calcutta, which could threaten the interests of the East India Company. This never happened. In late 1821, Buckingham was in court with his lawyer from the previous trial, Cutler Ferguson. Advocate General Spanky had moved court for criminal defamation and tried his best to suggest that Buckingham and his paper had cast aspersions on the official conduct of judges, officials, and all manner of government activities. 2 judges agreed. The move was granted. In January 1822, the secretary's libel suit came before the court. Buckingham was to be indicted on 10 counts. Advocate General Spanky made his opening statement by arguing that the liberty of the press did not mean that one could irritate or disturb the government. He went on to say that Sam Soberside's letter had argued that public officers were negligent in their duties. When he had finished, Cutler Ferguson rose to speak. He said that the Sam Soberside's letter was satire. It was a joke. He said that the entire ire of the government-favoured press in Bengal had been directed against his client for so long. Where was the moral grandstanding then? He added that there was only one faction here, the one that wanted the overthrow of the freedom of the press. The audience in the courtroom began murmuring. The jury retired to think about the verdict. The audience did not have to wait for long. The jury had reached a verdict. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted in jubilation. Buckingham had faced down the entire might of the Bengal presidency, and he had won. Spanky, the Advocate General, then pressed for the criminal libel, and the court refused to hear it. It was over, for now. Here is Callie again making sense of the Sam Sobersides affair.
That's a very interesting one because that's an example where it turned out that it was a military officer, but actually there's not any indication in the letter that it was, and that was not really part of the reaction against it. But what I find kind of interesting about that letter is it's quite important to James Silk Buckingham's personal biography because it was for that letter that he went to trial. The trial was so unsuccessful, so embarrassing for the East India Company because he was acquitted and it was widely publicized. It actually did Buckingham a lot of good in making him quite a celebrated figure in Britain where people were reading about this. So it's quite important in terms of the history of the Calcutta Journal and the press and in terms of Buckingham himself. And yet the subject of the letter seems very petty to us now. Because the original letter is mostly focused on it's sort of focused on Calcutta society, and it's sort of saying that the Governor General's entourage are very sort of, oh, they're so prissy and they think they're so great and they're very sort of cliquey and exclusive, and it's very much focused on social interactions that we wouldn't necessarily take that seriously or were worth that much of a reaction. But the letter became really controversial, and a lot of readers wrote in to complain about it. And then in response, another letter was written to say, well, we should be able to criticize, and we should be able to speak about public figures. And it was that letter that actually was the sort of catalyst for the libel proceedings. But to me, it sort of reflects how the personal and the political could really blur together during this period, because I think it's important to note that in terms of the prohibitions on the press that existed in the 1820s, one of them was, okay, you can't comment negatively on government proceedings, you can't bring government into disrepute, but another one was no private scandal. So, you can't comment on, people's personal lives, you can't sort of stir up scandal. And I think that is sort of a reflection of, first of all, a society where everyone knows each other, and so things can become very personal very quickly, but also maybe a certain culture of politeness where people think perhaps it's inappropriate to comment on someone's personal life. From a contemporary perspective, it can be ambivalent because on the one hand, I think we would say there are some things that probably should remain private and maybe we don't think it's appropriate to comment on. And certainly when you look at the Calcutta press of the 1820s, I think there are some cases where this fixation on people's personal lives and personal character, it can distract from larger issues. And sometimes we ask ourselves, well, why are people so fixated on these things that to us seem quite trivial? But on the other hand, I think it was also a tactic used by government to try and stifle debate, because often if someone made a criticism of government or if someone made some kind of critique, they would say, well, this is due to personal resentments. This is due to a personal rivalry or a personal feud. This is a personal attack. And so you can kind of see how, on the one hand, you don't want things to get too personal, but also if you say nothing personal can be made public, then that can become problematic as well. And especially within the military, army officers will often say they will complain that the journals are commenting on their private reputation. But in response, journal editors will say, well, what private reputation? You're a public figure, and the things that you do privately also carry over into your public life. So I think the Sam Sobersides controversy sort of speaks to people trying to negotiate those two things at a time when they didn't necessarily have the same understanding of public and private, and they were trying to figure out where the lines should be drawn or if the two were even distinguishable from each other. That's one of the things that's really animating this case.
In April 1822, the Calcutta Journal carried a letter from a person named a military friend, neither a mull nor a gull. The letter contained a criticism of that old weather-beaten horse, promotions in the East India Company's army. However, this letter writer had gone beyond to include a postscript that expressed a hope that a day would come when the natives of India would no longer be harassed by those who are supposed to protect them in courts and under rules and regulations. This was too much for the Bengal government. It demanded that Buckingham disclose the name of the letter writer. After consulting with the author of the letter, Buckingham did. It was an officer stationed at Nagpur, Lieutenant Colonel Robinson. Buckingham tried defending himself and Robinson, saying the publication of the letter was an unintentional error, but nobody was buying it. John Adam and Bailey, amongst others, recommended that Robinson be removed from his command and Buckingham be deported. Again, Francis Rawdon Hastings came to the rescue. He couldn't exactly disagree with John Adam and conceded that Buckingham had abused press freedom. However, he differed from Adam in one key regard. He did not see Buckingham as a threat to the state or a danger to public welfare. He was also annoyed at Adam's keenness to find yet another excuse to deport Buckingham. He thought the punishment should fit the crime. Deporting Buckingham was disproportionate punishment. Our take on this is that Hastings was right in taking a stance against deportation and against branding Buckingham as a threat to the state. I guess today Buckingham would have been called anti-national in India or part of the Tukre gang. Further, what we think cuts to the bone of every controversy that Buckingham became embroiled in is that he attacked people with privilege and he attacked the very idea of privilege. He launched salvos at the facade of dignity that protected the nasty acts that the privileged undertook. Buckingham really thought that if you kept attacking a system by destroying the culture of silence around it, you could destroy the institution because you would be destroying its legitimacy. Lieutenant Colonel Robinson was not as lucky as Buckingham. He was court-martialed and ordered back to England by Hastings. Tragically, he died on the way back. Hastings also introduced a new order which disallowed military officers from writing anonymously to newspapers to air their grievances.
But this did not exactly deter Buckingham. He continued to be the talk of the town in Calcutta. He was almost zealous in pointing out the wrongdoings of the East India Company's officials. He also knew that he was courting deportation, but he did not let that stop him. One thing that had always grated on his nerves was how the officers of the company often gave themselves or their friends multiple official positions in the company, drawing multiple salaries at the same time. This helped line their pockets with even more money. In 1822, a man called Dr. Jameson was appointed as a superintendent of a medical school for Indians. The problem was that Dr. Jameson already held 3 government offices. He was the secretary of the medical board, clerk of a committee that controlled stationery expenditure, and a practicing surgeon of the free school. Buckingham reported on this matter. Dr. Jameson asked for Buckingham's expulsion at being slandered in the press. And of course, John Adam crawled out of the woodwork and supported Jameson's call for deportation. He also said that press censorship should be reinstated. Governor General Hastings again ignored Adam, knowing that this was an old vendetta playing out against Buckingham. Jameson was so incensed at being ignored that he demanded that his name never be mentioned in the Calcutta Journal. Buckingham refused. So Jameson challenged him to a duel. Britishers and their obsession with duels. Am I right? Anyway, Buckingham said that he had the right to comment on the public character of individuals and agreed to the duel. He was now officially willing to die for his words. Both men chose their seconds for the duel. Seconds were kind of like assistants. Jameson picked a man called Rawdon and Buckingham chose one Major Sweeney. On August 5, 1822, the duellers met at the Ballygunge racetrack with their pistols and their seconds. At 12 paces, a shot was fired by each into the air. Then, a second shot was fired into the air. They also had to reload between the shots. Before the third shots could be fired by each, Sweeney, Buckingham's second, went up to Rawdon, Jameson's second, and told him that Buckingham was not going to muddy Jameson's private character, only his public one, and he would not apologize for reflecting on his public image. He also said that Buckingham would take no responsibility for what would come next, the third shot, which was not going to be fired in the air. Rawdon looked like he had been waiting for this. He said that by showing up to the duel, Buckingham had proved his honor and that Dr. Jameson did not want any more than this. In short, no one was shot.
But enemies were still around. The Bull and the Harkaru kept taking potshots at Buckingham and the Calcutta Journal. They thought Buckingham had become too big for his boots. The Harkaru called him a self-constituted board of control of affairs for India. The Bull was ostensibly a rare paper in the history of global journalism that batted against press freedom. It also asserted that the Governor-General had never intended to free the press, and that the only time anyone had heard of a free press in India was when Buckingham's Calcutta Journal had mentioned it. The Bull also asserted that the Governor-General had no power to free the press. This time, Buckingham was incensed. This was an attack not only on him, but also on Governor-General Hastings, who, if you recall, had defended him on matters of principle repeatedly. He crafted a takedown of the Bull's arguments by saying that the Bull had slandered the head of government. He also asserted that the censorship plan outlined in the John Adams Circular had never been registered at the court and therefore was never sanctioned by the Supreme Court and so did not have the force of law behind it. He didn't stop there. He attacked the system of deporting an editor if they displeased someone in the government. As this argument between John Bull and the Calcutta Journal raged, a remarkable thing happened. The Bengal Harkaru threw in its lot with Buckingham for a hot minute and defended the freedom of the press. But, staying on brand, they also suggested that Buckingham should have been deported long ago. Buckingham shot back, saying only the law and a jury, not the government, had the right to decide on his deportation. John Adams seized this opportunity to make an ask in front of the Supreme Council to revoke Buckingham's license to reside and operate in India, or be issued one final warning. According to Adam, by attacking the government's right to deport people, Buckingham had again questioned its authority and the authority of the Parliament in Britain. On 5th September 1822, a warning that said as much came Buckingham's way.
Perhaps Buckingham knew that he was in a losing battle. Every time he defended press freedoms and his own freedom to be an editor of a newspaper, he ran afoul of the conservative elements of the East India Company's government. He had always taken refuge in the power of law and legal processes to protect himself. However, he was beginning to realize that there is no defense against arbitrary power. Bailey also supported Adam now. As the censor, Bailey had been worried about the rising Indian language newspapers whose owners or editors could not be deported because they were Indian. As censorship had been abolished, He now asked for a licensing system. A month before Buckingham received his final warning from the government, the editorship of the John Bull came to rest with none other than his old foe, Reverend Samuel James Bryce, who had once been the editor of the Asiatic Mirror. Reverend Bryce, not worrying about the wrath of Jesus, launched severe attacks on Buckingham's character through anonymous letters. According to them, Buckingham was a low IQ, boastful liar, an impostor, a penniless plagiarist, and a public enemy. Buckingham did try to defend himself yet again. However, he was tired and he knew the reason he was being attacked was because of his liberal ideas. He called his attackers a band of moral assassins. Now it was Buckingham who sued John Bull for libel. More than anything, he wanted to know who exactly was attacking him. Reverend Bryce refused to reveal the names of the letter writers. In January 1823, a libel suit was filed. The timing was bad for Buckingham. Rawdon Hastings had left as Governor General. In the interim, until a new successor was found, John Adam had become the Governor General on January 13, 1823. Buckingham's number one enemy, who had dogged his every journalistic step in Bengal, now had uncontrolled power over him. Within 2 weeks, Spanky's case, the criminal libel case which had not been heard by the Supreme Court against Buckingham earlier, was now revived, and he was hauled before the court once more. It did not help matters that Thomas Unwin, one of the owners of John Bull, was a clerk of the Crown of the Supreme Court. In short, he was the guy that decided the jury for Buckingham's case. While Buckingham was facing this onslaught, John Adam was not making any secrets about whose side he was on. He appointed Reverend Bryce as the clerk of the stationery at a salary of £600 annually. Buckingham could not shut up. Here was another case of favoritism and one man being appointed to multiple paid posts. He wrote a scathing piece, wondering why a man of God was seeking earthly abundance and who was facilitating it and why. John Adam had had it. In the dim halls of the government house in Calcutta, he issued the order revoking Buckingham's license. He was the Governor General, however temporarily. He did not even wait to discuss the matter with the Supreme Council. In his minute justifying his order, he stated that Buckingham's long-term plan was to organize an opposition to the government. Buckingham was incorrigible and defiant. He would never mend his ways. In his own words, John Adam explained, "I am using power strictly as a shield, not as a weapon. I will not compromise the public interest by sanctioning the unrestrained indulgence of a spirit which produces the most extensive evil." Historian Dr. Ritika Prasad, a friend of the podcast, situated the entire Buckingham affair in the larger context of the emerging press in a colonial state for us.
I think with Buckingham, one of the things that is critical to remember is that crushing the press visibly looks like despotism. And that is exactly what the colonial state wants to distance itself from. There is no popular representation. And in a way, ironically perhaps, this makes the claims of the press even stronger because they identify themselves as the only check on governance or misgovernance. So instead of being one of several mechanisms that capture public opinion or act as checks and balances, the press argues that it is up to only them to rein in misgovernance or the abuse of power, all of which, would amount to despotism. It doesn't mean that they are not really upset and angry with Buckingham, but they have to pay attention to the public consequences of this decision. And I think this is shown quite well because by the end, Buckingham has aggravated just about everybody, including Rawdon Hastings, who is considered the most liberal of them all. And Rawdon Hastings, what he says privately and publicly are different, and the private utterings show how fed up he is of Buckingham. But, the words he says publicly show that he is almost hostage to his own sort of proclaimed liberalism. And Buckingham, of course, knows this. And at some point, what happens is he pushes the envelope so far. But if you see the list of infractions before that happens, it's quite stunning. And when I was in the archives, I just kept reading one after the other. It was endless. And you see, even in the long version in the article, you see a shortened list. But the list was substantially longer. But as he keeps violating the authority or prohibitions, he keeps actually saying that he respects the authority of the state and the censors. And this is formulaic, but it is also part of the structure of negotiations. There is a sense that he, along with other editors and writers, knew what was required of them. And Buckingham's, final denouement of Buckingham's case shows moments when the structure just breaks down, the structure of negotiations, and becomes untenable. But there are long stretches, many years, when it does operate and it is not fake. It is hypocritical because the apologies are not genuine, because he just reoffends. But there is a recognition that this is what is necessary for the process to continue without breaking down. We can also integrate Duane into this discussion of Buckingham because something similar happens, which is that colonial officials have to be pushed to breaking point. And of course, the writers like Buckingham don't want to be deported, become destitute. But even knowing the penalties, they push the boundaries up to a certain point. And I think at the end, they fail precisely because they have succeeded in the past. That is, they don't realize when the line is finally crossed. Buckingham escaped so many times. Why would he think this time would be different? So I think there is a little bit of specific calculations within this structure, and Buckingham's case shows that.
4 days after Buckingham had published his attack on Bryce and John Adam, he received the notice revoking his license. This meant that now he could stay in India for a total of 2 months only, as no one could stay beyond a stipulated period without a valid working license in India. His departure was scheduled for April 15, 1823. The days that Buckingham had left in India were filled with him brooding and watching his possessions being auctioned. He wasn't done with John Adam, though. He knew that under law he could bring a lawsuit for damages against him. After all, he was losing a lot of money by being put out of business. The last pamphlet he wrote in Bengal informed the public about his next step and stated that he would always fight against arbitrary power that sought to ruin others. Nevertheless, Buckingham left India on a ship called the Sir Edward Paget and sailed for London. Buckingham had not shut down the Calcutta Journal. He had handed over its command to one Mr. Sandys, who was an Anglo-Indian and therefore could not be deported. To support Mr. Sandys, he had also appointed 2 Englishmen, Sanford Arnott and James Sutherland, and he had also left £2,700 to help carry on the paper. A week after Buckingham left, John Adam issued new press regulations. No paper or press could be set up without a license from the government, and these licenses could be revoked at any time. All illegal presses and papers were to be confiscated, and every book was to carry on the last page the names and addresses of its publisher and printer. The Calcutta Journal's new editor Sanders was specifically threatened. He would be punished if the Calcutta Journal so much as hinted that it was going to flout some rule or regulation. Adam now had to get the Supreme Court to ratify and establish this new licensing system for papers and presses. However, the Supreme Council decided that anyone who had an objection to these measures could table their opposition before the Supreme Court on the 31st of May, 1823. On that appointed day, the courtroom was filled. Cutler Ferguson, Buckingham's fiery lawyer, who was today going to argue the case for a new petitioner, waited patiently. As he checked his timepiece, he realized that people in the courtroom had begun murmuring. Cutler Ferguson turned around to see an Indian man walk in. This is what had caused the asides and whispers. This Indian man walked in confidently, boldly, ignoring the eyes staring and glaring at him. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, and he was dressed in traditional Indian clothing. A shock of curly hair rested under an intricately tied, colourful turban. A small smile played on his lips, and he nodded when he saw Cutler Ferguson. Ferguson smiled back and beckoned him over. Everyone in the courtroom stared at the pair. Soon the court was in session. The whispers died down, although eyes remained directed at the Indian man. Cutler Ferguson rose to speak on behalf of his Indian client, who was apparently the petitioner against John Adams' press rules. He stated that extreme regulations would stop Indians from showing the government how their administrative officers committed injustices. Could the government suppress publications just because they didn't agree with them? As Cutler Ferguson spoke, the Indian man looked straight ahead at Judge Macnaghten. His face betrayed no emotion. He was still. Cutler Ferguson spoke again. He said, "The new rules are an act of despotism, which is meant to preserve power by keeping natives in ignorance." The courtroom erupted in loud applause. The Indian man turned to Cutler Ferguson and nodded at him. This is exactly what he had wanted, and Ferguson had done his job well. Judge Macnaghten had to call for order. Unfortunately for Cutler Ferguson and his Indian petitioner, John Adams' new rules were registered, and the petitioner's plea was ignored. As Ferguson and his Indian client left the courthouse, a man hurried up to them. His curiosity had got the better of him. "I'm sorry, but who are you?" he asked the Indian man. The Indian man turned his head slowly, surely, and regally. "My name," he said, "is Ram Mohan Roy." That and more next season on Reality Scribes.
We would like to thank all the experts who have come on this podcast this season to share their invaluable time with us. This season would not have been possible without the insightful perspectives of Aparajita Das, Dr. Callie Wilkinson, Dr. Andrew Otis, and Dr. Ritika Prasad. Reality Scribes has been conceptualized, scripted, narrated, and produced by Vasundhara Sirnet and me, Sumit Chaturvedi. All source material used in this episode can be found in the description below. The views expressed by guests on the podcast are their own and do not always reflect the opinions of Reality Scribes or the podcast hosts. You can listen to Reality Scribes on iTunes, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Don't forget to like, share, and comment, and do subscribe to our channel. Also click the bell icon for notifications for when we drop a new episode. You can follow us on social media at Reality Scribes on X, Instagram, Facebook, and Patreon. You can also email us your questions and comments at realityscribes@gmail.com for a chance to be featured on our podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time.